May 1945. Somewhere in the waters southeast of Okinawa, a destroyer took a kamikaze strike amidships. The impact tore through the superstructure, igniting aviation fuel stored too close to the galley. Within seconds, flames climbed the mast and spread toward the ammunition magazine. The ship's loudspeaker crackled once. Fire parties to Station 3. 5 minutes. No one needed to explain what 5 minutes meant. Everyone aboard knew. It was the difference between sailing home and sinking with the ship still burning around them. In the Pacific Theater, this became known as the 5-minute rule, an unwritten law learned through tragedy, drilled into exhaustion, and proven in blood. It meant that from the moment fire broke out aboard a warship, crews had roughly 5 minutes to contain it before the blaze became uncontrollable. After 5 minutes, steel buckled, bulkheads failed, ammunition cooked off, fuel lines ruptured, and the ship, no matter how large or well-armored, transformed from a vessel of war into a floating tomb. This is the story of the men who raced against that clock, the damage control teams, engineers and ordinary sailors who learned that survival at sea was measured not in firepower or armor, but in seconds saved and flames smothered before they spread. It is a story without heroics, only the grim mathematics of heat, metal, and time. It is about the training no one wanted, the drills that seemed pointless, and the moments when every repeated motion, every hated exercise, became the only thing standing between life and drowning in darkness. Before we continue, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here we tell real untold stories of World War II, stories of fire, fear, and the impossible choices made below deck when the ship began to die. The Pacific War was not won by battleships alone. It was won by the men who kept those ships afloat long enough to fight another day. And for them, the enemy was not always the one firing from across the water. Sometimes the enemy was time itself, 5 minutes that felt like 5 seconds, and the knowledge that once those minutes passed, nothing else mattered. This is their story. This is the rule they lived by. And this is why, when the fires came, only the fastest survived. Chapter 1. The Clock. No one could see. The fire began in the engine room of a cruiser during a night engagement off the Solomon Islands. No one saw the exact moment it started. One instant, the turbines roared at full power, pushing the ship through black water under blackout conditions. The next, a Japanese shell punched through the hull plating below the waterline, sheared a fuel line, and sent pressurized oil spraying across superheated metal. The explosion was small, almost polite. A muffled thump that rattled the deck plates but didn't shake the bridge. For 3 seconds, the engine room crew stood frozen, staring at the orange glow spreading across the bulkhead. Then the chief engineer shouted a single word, "Go," and the clock began. 5 minutes. That was all they had. The rule wasn't written in any manual. It wasn't taught at the Naval Academy or discussed in strategy meetings. It was discovered through loss, through ships that burned and sank while rescue efforts continued long after containment became impossible, through autopsies of wrecks that revealed a common pattern. Fires that started small became catastrophic between 4 and 6 minutes after ignition. The steel itself betrayed them. Warships were designed to float and fight, not to resist sustained internal fire. Once flames reached critical temperature, bulkheads warped, watertight seals failed, ammunition storage became ovens, and the ship, no matter how many men fought the blaze, was already dying. The crew in that engine room understood this without speaking. They had drilled for it every week since leaving port. Endless repetitions of the same scenario, simulated fire, timed response, critiques that felt like punishment. They hated the drills, complained about them during chow, mocked the officer who made them practice donning breathing apparatus in under 30 seconds. But now, as smoke filled the compartment and the temperature spiked, their hands moved without thought. One man grabbed the foam nozzle, another sealed the ventilation ducts, a third triggered the CO2 system, flooding the lower deck with gas that choked flames but also choked men. The chief engineer stood at the hatch counting seconds aloud, his voice steady despite the heat warping the air around him. 60 seconds gone, 4 minutes remaining. Above them, the ship continued fighting. Gun crews fired at shapes in the darkness. Radar operators called out ranges. The captain ordered evasive maneuvers, unaware that below his feet, his vessel was deciding whether to live or die. The battle on the surface mattered, but the battle in the engine room mattered more. 90 seconds, 3.5 minutes left. The foam wasn't working. The oil fire fed on itself, spreading across the deck faster than the chemicals could smother it. One sailor slipped on the slick metal, his glove melting against a hot pipe. He didn't scream. He bit down on the pain and kept moving, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant everyone else died too. 2 minutes, 3 minutes remaining. The chief made the call. Seal it. Seal it now. The order meant abandoning the lower engine room. It meant trapping the fire inside a steel box and hoping the bulkheads held. It also meant leaving behind 2 men who were still inside, trying to shut off a valve that kept feeding fuel to the flames. They knew what the order meant. They had drilled for this too. One of them glanced toward the hatch, saw the chief's face and nodded once. The hatch clanged shut. The wheel spun. The seal locked. 3 minutes, 40 seconds. 1 minute, 20 seconds left. Inside the sealed compartment, the 2 men kept working. They couldn't hear the ocean anymore. Couldn't hear the guns. Just the roar of fire and the hiss of steam where seawater met molten metal. They finished closing the valve, cutting off the fuel supply. Then they sat down on the deck, backs against the bulkhead, and waited. 4 minutes, 50 seconds. The fire began to die. Starved of fuel, choked by CO2, contained within steel walls that somehow, impossibly, still held. On the other side of the hatch, the chief engineer pressed his hand against the metal, feeling the heat slowly fade. 5 minutes, 10 seconds. The ship did not explode. The magazine did not cook off. The hull did not buckle. The cruiser sailed on, trailing smoke, listing slightly to port but afloat. Above deck, sailors cheered a hit on an enemy destroyer. Below deck, damage control teams opened the sealed compartment and found 2 men unconscious from heat and gas, but alive. The clock had stopped. The rule had held, but everyone knew. 5 minutes was all they ever had, and next time they might not be fast enough. Chapter 2. The Drills They Hated. October 1943. A destroyer moored at Pearl Harbor, 3 weeks before deploying to the Central Pacific. The crew stood on deck at 600, salt air mixing with diesel fumes, watching their new damage control officer step forward with a stopwatch in one hand and a clipboard in the other. Fire drill, he announced. Engine room scenario, full gear. You have 4 minutes to contain a simulated blaze, restore pressure, and report clear. If you fail, we do it again. If you fail twice, we do it all day. Groans rippled through the ranks. They had done this yesterday, and the day before. Every morning since the officer came aboard, they had practiced the same routines until their hands moved by muscle memory, and their backs ached from crouching in mock smoke. This is stupid, someone muttered. We know how to fight fires. The officer heard him. He didn't respond with anger. He simply said, the men on the Lexington knew how to fight fires too. So did the crew of the Wasp. They're at the bottom of the ocean now because knowing isn't enough. Speed is enough, nothing else. He clicked the stopwatch. Begin. The drill was designed to simulate chaos. Smoke grenades filled compartments with thick gray fog. Alarms blared at random intervals. Hatches were jammed. Equipment was deliberately misplaced. And through it all, the stopwatch kept ticking, measuring every second lost to hesitation, confusion, or poor coordination. The first run took 6 minutes, 40 seconds. Failure. The second took 5 minutes, 50 seconds. Failure. The third took 5 minutes, 12 seconds. Still failure. Again, the officer said. They hated him, hated the drills, hated the repetition, hated the way he stood there with his clipboard, emotionless while they sweated through their coveralls and bruised their knees on steel deck plating. But they ran the drill again, and again, and again. By noon, they were down to 4 minutes, 30 seconds. By evening, 4 minutes flat. The officer made them run it once more after dark, with no lights except their flashlights, and they still cleared it in 4 minutes, 20 seconds. Better, he said. Tomorrow we add flooding. The crew wanted to hate him, but some of them had served on other ships. Some had watched friends burn. Some had floated in oil-slicked water, waiting for rescue, wondering why their vessels sank so fast when it seemed like such a small fire. They didn't understand the 5-minute rule yet, but they were learning its arithmetic. Now tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and how far these forgotten wartime stories have reached. Your voice helps keep memory alive. The drills intensified. Scenarios grew more complex. Simulated fires in the galley while simulated flooding breached the forward hold. Simulated casualties blocking passageways. Simulated communication failures forcing teams to operate without orders. Every weakness was exposed, every mistake was cataloged. Every second wasted was analyzed. And slowly, grudgingly, the crew began to move like a single organism. One man triggered the foam system while another sealed ventilation without needing to be told. A third activated pumps before the order came through. They stopped thinking and started reacting, their bodies trained to respond faster than their minds could process danger. 3 months later, when that same destroyer took a torpedo hit off Saipan and fire erupted in the aft magazine, the crew had exactly 4 minutes, 40 seconds to prevent a catastrophic explosion. They contained it in 4 minutes, 8 seconds. 17 men survived because they had hated those drills enough to make them perfect. Chapter 3. When the kamikaze came, April 1945, the radar operator called out the contact at 20 miles. A single aircraft, low and fast, heading directly toward the task force. Fighters scrambled. Anti-aircraft guns swiveled toward the bearing. Every eye on the bridge tracked the distant speck growing larger against the gray sky. The plane was a Zero, or what remained of one. Its engine coughed black smoke. Its wings were riddled with bullet holes, but it kept coming, weaving through flak, ignoring the tracers that chased it across the sky. The pilot had one mission, one target, one final act. He chose a destroyer on the edge of the formation. The impact came at 14:20 hours. The Zero struck the ship just forward of the bridge, its fuselage disintegrating on contact, but its engine and fuel tanks punching through the deck like a meteor. Burning aviation gasoline sprayed across 3 compartments. Shrapnel shredded steam lines. The explosion killed 4 men instantly and trapped a dozen more below deck. The ship's alarm system triggered automatically. Fire, fire, fire. All damage control parties, report to stations. Fire in compartments 2, 3, and 4. In the engine room, the chief engineer checked his watch. 14:20 and 30 seconds. 5 minutes. That was all they had. The damage control teams were already moving. They had trained for this exact scenario 17 times in the past month. They knew the layout of those compartments by heart, knew which hatches led where, knew which valves controlled which systems, knew that hesitation equaled death. 2 teams converged on compartment 3 from opposite directions. One carried foam canisters. The other dragged hoses connected to the ship's saltwater pumps. They moved through smoke so thick they couldn't see their own hands, navigating by touch and memory. 60 seconds gone. The heat inside compartment 3 was already unbearable. Steel walls radiated warmth like an oven. The air itself seemed to burn. One sailor's breathing apparatus malfunctioned, filling his mask with smoke instead of filtered air. He ripped it off, took 3 breaths of superheated gas, and kept crawling toward the fire. Stopping wasn't an option. 90 seconds gone. The foam hit the flames first, smothering the surface fire. But beneath it, the aviation fuel continued burning. It had soaked into deck seams, dripped into cable conduits, pooled in corners where foam couldn't reach. The fire was dying in some places and spreading in others, playing a game of survival that mirrored the crew's own desperation. 2 minutes gone. Above them, the ship's guns continued firing at distant aircraft. The war didn't pause for internal crises. The task force maintained formation. Orders crackled over radio circuits. And below deck, men fought an enemy that didn't care about tactics or strategy, only heat and oxygen and the slow collapse of steel under stress. 2 minutes, 30 seconds. One of the trapped sailors, a 19-year-old from Ohio, found himself sealed inside a compartment filling with smoke. The hatch had warped from the heat. He couldn't open it from inside. He could hear his crewmates on the other side working to pry it free, but he couldn't see anything except darkness, and couldn't breathe anything except poison. He sat down, back against the bulkhead, and thought about his mother's letters. She always ended them the same way. Come home safe. He wondered if she would ever know how he died. Wondered if anyone would. 3 minutes gone. The hatch gave way. Hands reached through, grabbed his collar, and dragged him into clearer air. He coughed until he vomited, then crawled back into the smoke with the others, because the fire wasn't out yet, and 5 minutes weren't up. 3 minutes, 40 seconds. The saltwater hoses finally reached the fuel source, flooding the compartment with seawater that hissed and steamed as it met burning metal. The temperature began to drop, the smoke began to thin, and slowly, impossibly, the flames began to retreat. 4 minutes, 30 seconds. The chief engineer stood at the bulkhead listening to damage reports over the sound-powered phone. Compartment 2 contained. Compartment 3 90% suppressed. Compartment 4 still active but not spreading. 4 minutes, 50 seconds. Seal compartment 4. The captain ordered from the bridge. We can't risk the magazine. Sir, we still have men inside. I know. Seal it. The order came down the chain. The damage control officer hesitated for 1 second, one precious second, then gave the command. The hatch to compartment 4 began to close. 5 minutes. The last man inside compartment 4 threw himself through the narrowing gap, his jacket catching on the hatch mechanism. Someone grabbed him and yanked him clear. The hatch sealed. The wheel locked. 5 minutes, 10 seconds. The fire in compartment 4 burned for another 20 minutes, but it burned alone, trapped behind steel that held just long enough. The magazine didn't explode. The ship didn't sink. When they finally opened the compartment, they found scorch marks on the bulkhead 6 inches from where the ammunition was stored. 6 inches between survival and annihilation. The destroyer limped back to port with a hole in its deck and smoke stains that would never quite wash clean. But it sailed under its own power, carrying every man who had been aboard when the kamikaze struck. The 5-minute rule had held. Barely. Chapter 4. The Mathematics of Heat and Metal. November 1944. A research facility in San Diego, far from combat, where naval engineers studied wreckage recovered from sunken ships. They worked in laboratories that smelled of oil and seawater, examining twisted steel and melted components, trying to understand why some vessels survived catastrophic damage while others did not. The answer, they discovered, was depressingly simple: time. One engineer, a former merchant marine officer who had survived 2 torpedo attacks, spent months analyzing fire patterns. He measured the temperature at which bulkheads failed, calculated the rate at which flames spread through different compartment configurations, timed how long it took for ammunition to reach cooking-off temperature when exposed to sustained heat. His report concluded with a single paragraph that would change damage control doctrine for the rest of the war. In every case examined, fires that were contained within 5 minutes of ignition resulted in ship survival rates above 80%. Fires that burned longer than 5 minutes resulted in total loss rates above 70%. The critical variable is not the size of the initial fire, but the speed of the response. A small fire becomes catastrophic, not through intensity, but through time. 5 minutes, that was the threshold, the invisible line between salvageable and doomed. But why 5 minutes? What made that specific span so crucial? The answer lay in the nature of warship construction. Naval vessels were designed as compartmentalized structures, divided into sections by watertight bulkheads and fire-resistant doors. This design allowed damage to be isolated. A torpedo hit in one area wouldn't necessarily sink the entire ship, but the system had a weakness: the bulkheads themselves. Steel loses structural integrity at temperatures above 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Most shipboard fires reach that temperature within 3 to 4 minutes. Once the bulkheads began to warp, the seals failed. Smoke and flames spread to adjacent compartments. The fire stopped being contained and started being exponential. And once exponential spread began, nothing could stop it. Pumps couldn't deliver water fast enough. Foam couldn't smother flames in multiple locations simultaneously. Crew members couldn't reach affected areas before being overcome by heat and smoke. The ship began to die, and no amount of heroism could save it. The engineers calculated that damage control teams needed approximately 90 seconds to identify the fire location, another 60 seconds to reach it with equipment, and roughly 2 minutes to apply suppression measures. That left a margin of 30 seconds for unexpected complications, 30 seconds to account for jammed hatches, injured crew members, equipment failures, communication breakdowns, all the chaos that war guaranteed. 30 seconds between life and death. The Navy began implementing new training protocols based on this research. Drills became timed exercises measured in minutes and seconds, rather than vague assessments of readiness. Damage control parties practiced not just fighting fires, but fighting them fast. Equipment was relocated to reduce response time. Communication systems were upgraded to ensure orders reached crew members within seconds rather than minutes. And throughout the fleet, officers began drilling the same message into their sailors. 5 minutes. That was all they had. That was all they would ever have. Some ships embraced the new doctrine. Others resisted, viewing it as bureaucratic interference with practical seamanship. The difference in outcomes was stark. If this story has moved you, leave a like. It helps others discover how humanity can survive even inside the walls of captivity. In March 1945, 2 destroyers from the same task force took kamikaze hits within hours of each other. The first destroyer had trained under the new protocols, running timed drills every day for 6 months. The second had relied on traditional damage control training, emphasizing equipment proficiency over speed. The first destroyer contained its fires in 4 minutes, 30 seconds. 12 men died in the initial impact, but the ship survived. The second destroyer fought its fires for 18 minutes before abandoning ship. 97 men died, and the vessel sank before rescue ships could reach it. The only difference between them was preparation. The only difference was knowing that 5 minutes was all they had, and training every single day to beat that clock. The engineers in San Diego continued their work, analyzing more wrecks, refining their calculations, but the fundamental truth never changed. Fire aboard a warship was not measured in intensity. It was measured in time, and time once lost could never be recovered. Chapter 5. The Silence Between Alarms. January 1945. Somewhere in the Philippine Sea, a battleship cruised through calm waters under overcast skies. The war felt distant that morning. Radar showed no contacts. Lookouts reported empty horizons. The crew moved through routine duties with the mechanical efficiency of men who had done the same tasks 1,000 times before. In the damage control station, a young ensign reviewed checklists. Foam canisters, full. Hoses, properly stowed. Pumps, tested and operational. Breathing apparatus, inspected and ready. Everything was in order. Everything was always in order. He wondered if they would ever need it. The battleship had been in theater for 11 months without taking serious damage. A few near misses from bombs, some shrapnel scarring on the superstructure, but nothing that tested the damage control teams beyond routine maintenance. The crew joked that their ship was blessed, that enemy pilots couldn't see it, that the ocean itself protected them. The ensign didn't believe in blessings. He believed in preparation, and he knew that the longer they went without incident, the more likely it became that when something finally happened, it would be catastrophic. He ran drills anyway, every day. Same scenarios, same timed exercises, same critiques when teams finished 30 seconds too slow. The crew complained, called him paranoid, said he was preparing for a disaster that would never come. He kept running the drills. At 1340 hours, the disaster came. Not from the air, not from a submarine, from within. An electrical fire started in a junction box near the forward magazine. Nobody knew exactly what caused it. A frayed wire, a loose connection. Some small failure in a system that had worked perfectly for months. The fire was tiny at first, just sparks and smoking insulation, but it was spreading through cable conduits that ran throughout the ship, hidden behind bulkheads, inaccessible and invisible. The first alarm came at 1341. Smoke detector in compartment 12. The damage control teams responded within 40 seconds. They found the junction box, already half melted, flames licking up the cables like climbing vines. They deployed foam, cut power to the circuit, thought they had contained it. They hadn't. The fire had already spread through the conduits, was already climbing toward the upper decks, was already circling back toward the magazine through pathways the crew couldn't see. At 1346, a second alarm. Compartment 18, 2 decks above the first fire. At 1347, a third alarm. Compartment 9, adjacent to the ammunition storage. The fires weren't random. They were connected, and they were spreading faster than the teams could respond. The captain made the decision at 1348. General quarters. All hands to battle stations. Prepare to flood forward magazines. Flooding the magazines meant drowning thousands of rounds of ammunition in seawater. It meant rendering the ship's primary weapons useless. It meant accepting defeat against an enemy that consisted of nothing more than burning wire and spreading heat. But it also meant staying afloat. The damage control team split into 3 groups. One fought the fire in compartment 12. Another tackled compartment 18. The third raced to compartment 9, trying to reach the magazine before the flames did. Time became fluid. Minutes felt like seconds. Every action happened too slow. Every response came too late. The fire moved through the walls like a living thing, following paths that didn't appear on any blueprint, exploiting weaknesses that nobody had anticipated. At 1352, 6 minutes after the first alarm, the team in compartment 9 reported success. They had contained the blaze, cut it off from the magazine, saved the ship from exploding. At 1353, the bulkhead between compartments 9 and 10 collapsed. The fire poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. It engulfed the passageway, cut off the team's escape route, trapped 4 men on the wrong side of the flames. The ensign was one of them. He stood in the smoke, feeling heat radiate through his protective gear, and thought about all those drills, all those timed exercises. All those scenarios they had practiced over and over until everyone was sick of them. None of the drills had prepared him for this. This wasn't a simulation. This was real heat, real smoke, real terror. And all the preparation in the world couldn't change the fact that he was trapped and the fire was winning. But the drills had taught him something else. They had taught him not to freeze, not to panic, not to waste time questioning what to do next. His hands moved automatically, located the emergency breathing apparatus mounted on the bulkhead, activated the backup pump system, opened the ventilation override that would flood the compartment with fire-suppressing gas, even though it would also make breathing nearly impossible. He did all this in 40 seconds. The other 3 men followed his lead. They didn't discuss it, didn't debate, just acted, because they had practiced these movements so many times that thought wasn't necessary. The gas flooded in, the fire choked, and in the sudden relative darkness they crawled toward the secondary hatch, the one that wasn't part of the drill scenarios, the one they had only used during inspections. At 13:56, they emerged on the deck below, gasping and coughing but alive. At 13:59, 9 minutes after the first alarm, the fires were fully contained. The battleship didn't explode, didn't sink, didn't even need to flood the magazines. In the aftermath, when the engineering teams investigated, they discovered that the electrical fire had exploited a design flaw nobody had documented. Cable conduits that weren't supposed to connect actually did, creating a hidden network through which flames could spread undetected. The flaw was corrected fleet-wide within a month. But the ensign kept thinking about those 9 minutes, about how close they had come to losing everything, about how all the preparation and training had barely been enough. He kept running the drills, and the crew stopped complaining. Chapter 6. The Choice, at the Hatch, March 1945. The aircraft carrier took 3 bomb hits during a dusk attack off Iwo Jima. The first bomb struck the flight deck and detonated among parked aircraft, creating a cascade of secondary explosions as fuel tanks ruptured and ammunition cooked off. The second bomb penetrated the deck and exploded inside the hangar bay, turning the enclosed space into a blast furnace. The third bomb missed, but its near miss buckled hull plates and opened seams that let seawater flood the lower decks. Fire and flood, the 2 disasters every sailor feared most, happening simultaneously. In the damage control center, the officer watched status boards light up with red indicators. Fire in the hangar bay, fire on the flight deck, fire in ready rooms 1, 3, and 5, flooding in compartments A204, A207, and A214, casualty reports streaming in, communications breaking down as phone circuits failed. He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Seal the hangar bay, he ordered. All personnel evacuate. Seal it now. The hangar bay was an inferno. 30 aircraft burning, fuel lines ruptured, ammunition exploding in random bursts. The temperature inside exceeded 1,500 degrees. Nothing could survive there, but 70 men were still inside. Some were already dead, killed in the initial explosions. Others were trapped behind flames, cut off from exits by walls of fire. A few were still fighting, still trying to save aircraft, still believing they could somehow contain the disaster. The order to seal the hangar bay meant abandoning all of them. It also meant saving the ship. If the hangar bay remained open, the fire would spread to the flight deck above and the gallery deck below. It would reach fuel storage, reach magazines, reach the engine rooms, and then the carrier, all 27,000 tons of it, would become a floating bomb. The damage control officer knew this, had studied the reports from other carriers that burned, had read testimonies from survivors who described how quickly fire spread through open hangars, had memorized the Navy's own analysis. Unsealed hangar fires resulted in total ship loss within 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Not enough time to evacuate. Not enough time to fight. Just enough time to watch the ship die. He gave the order again. Seal the hangar bay. All blast doors. Do it now. The doors began to close. Massive steel panels sliding down from the overhead, driven by hydraulic rams that didn't care about the men on the wrong side. The sailors operating the door controls could hear screaming from inside the hangar, could hear pounding on the metal, could hear voices shouting to wait, to hold the doors, to give them 30 more seconds. They closed the doors anyway, because the officer had given the order, because they understood what would happen if they didn't, because saving 70 men meant losing 800, and mathematics didn't care about morality. The doors sealed with a hollow boom that echoed through the ship. The fire was contained, trapped inside a steel box measuring 200 feet by 60 feet, burning at temperatures that turned metal into slag. For 5 minutes, The damage control teams waited, monitored the bulkheads for signs of failure, watched temperature gauges climb toward critical levels, prepared to flood the compartment if the steel began to buckle. The bulkheads held. The fire, starved of oxygen, began to consume itself. Smoke vented through emergency exhaust systems. Temperature readings slowly declined, and gradually, impossibly, the crisis stabilized. At 15 minutes after the attack, the flooding in the lower decks was controlled. At 20 minutes, the fires on the flight deck were extinguished. At 25 minutes, the carrier was no longer in immediate danger of sinking. At 30 minutes, they opened the hangar bay doors. The heat that rolled out was still intense enough to blister paint on the opposite bulkhead. Smoke poured into the gallery deck in thick black waves, and through the haze, damage control teams entered the hangar, searching for survivors. They found 12 men, 12 out of 70, huddled in a small compartment at the aft end of the hangar where smoke hadn't penetrated and heat hadn't been quite enough to kill. They were unconscious from oxygen deprivation, but alive. 58 others had died, some from the initial explosions, most from the fire, a few from smoke inhalation after the doors sealed, trapped in pockets where the air turned to poison while they waited for rescue that never came. The damage control officer wrote letters to 58 families. He explained that their sons, husbands, brothers had died serving their country. He didn't explain that he had ordered the doors sealed while they were still alive. Didn't explain that he had made a choice between saving some and saving all. Didn't explain that by any tactical measure, it had been the correct decision. The carrier returned to service 6 weeks later, repaired, refitted, sent back to war, and in every drill conducted aboard that ship afterward, the crew practiced the same scenario: fire in the hangar bay, men trapped inside, orders to seal the compartment. They practiced it so they would understand, so they would know that sometimes the right choice was also the cruelest one, so they would be ready when their turn came to close the doors while men still screamed on the other side. Because the 5-minute rule didn't just apply to fighting fires, it applied to making decisions, and 5 minutes wasn't enough time for mercy, for second-guessing, for hoping that maybe this once, the physics would be different. 5 minutes was enough time to save the ship, or watch it burn, nothing else.